in the city of Rosario, Argentina, on the 14th of June, 1928, a boy was born into a family that belonged to the fading edges of aristocracy. His parents named him Ernesto after his father, but the world would one day call him by another name entirely. His father was an engineer with radical opinions and a restless spirit, and his mother came from a family of old wealth that had slowly crumbled with time. From the very beginning, this was a household that argued about politics over dinner, that read widely, that believed ideas mattered as much as bread on the table. When Ernesto was barely 2 years old, he was struck by a severe attack of asthma, and it never truly left him. It would return again and again throughout his childhood, some nights so brutal that he could not lie flat to sleep, gasping for air while his mother sat beside him until dawn. Doctors suggested the family move to a drier climate, so they relocated to Alta Gracia, a small town in the hills of Cordoba, hoping the mountain air would ease his lungs. It did not cure him, but it shaped him. A boy who could not run freely with other children learned instead to read. He devoured books, poetry, philosophy, adventure novels, anything he could find in his father's library and beyond it. He learned to play chess with a seriousness far beyond his years, and strangely, instead of retreating from physical hardship, something in him decided to defy it. He swam in cold rivers when doctors warned him not to. He played rugby despite attacks that left him wheezing on the sidelines. Those who knew him then remember a boy who refused to be told what his body could not do. His mother, Celia, was perhaps the deepest influence on his early mind. She was fiercely intelligent, unconventional for her era, and she encouraged her son to think for himself rather than accept the world as it was presented to him. She taught him French. She discussed literature and politics with him as though he were already an adult. It was in this atmosphere, at once loving and intellectually restless, that the earliest seeds of a questioning mind were planted, long before he ever picked up a rifle or wrote a single line about revolution. As a teenager, he was known among friends for his stubbornness and his dry sense of humor, for the nickname Fuser that his rugby teammates gave him, a combination of his aggressive playing style and his asthmatic wheeze. He was a young man who loved to argue, who read Marx and Freud and Baudelaire side by side, who wrote poetry that he rarely showed anyone. He was curious about everything, but medicine in particular began to call to him, perhaps because of his own childhood spent fighting for breath. Perhaps because of a grandmother whose illness and death he witnessed firsthand while nursing her in her final days. Whatever the reason, in 1948, he enrolled at the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine, with a particular interest in diseases like leprosy and allergies, the kinds of afflictions that marked the poor and the forgotten. But it was not medicine alone that would define his 20s. In 1951, while still a student, he decided to take a break from his studies and see the continent he had only read about in books. Along with his friend Alberto Granado, a biochemist several years older than him, he set out on a journey that would later become legendary. First on a rickety old motorcycle they nicknamed La Poderosa, the Mighty One. Though it was anything but mighty and broke down more than once along the way. When the motorcycle finally gave out entirely, they continued on foot, by boat, by hitchhiking, moving through Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. This journey changed him in ways no lecture hall ever could. He saw indigenous communities living in conditions of desperate poverty, their lands and dignity stripped away by generations of colonization and neglect. He visited a leper colony in Peru, at San Pablo on the banks of the Amazon, where he insisted on shaking hands with patients without gloves, treating them not as outcasts, but as fellow human beings. A small gesture that the doctors and patients there never forgot. He saw mining towns in Chile where workers labored under brutal conditions for wages that could barely feed their families, while the profits flowed elsewhere to distant shareholders who would never set foot in those mountains. Piece by piece, the young medical student who had set out mostly for adventure began to see South America not as a patchwork of separate nations, but as a single wounded body, suffering from the same disease of inequality and foreign exploitation everywhere he looked. He wrote in his travel diary that a person who had seen these things could no longer be the same person as before. He was not wrong. When he returned home, something fundamental in him had shifted. He finished his medical degree in 1953, becoming a doctor at last, but he did not stay long in Argentina. He was restless, hungry to see more, and soon set out again, first to Bolivia, where he witnessed a national revolution in its early aftermath, then onward to Guatemala. Drawn by reports of a government, they're attempting genuine land reform for the poor under President Jacobo Arbenz. It was in Guatemala that his political education deepened sharply. He watched as the United States, through the Central Intelligence Agency, backed a coup that toppled Arbenz's government in 1954, protecting the interests of a powerful American fruit company whose land holdings were threatened by the reforms. For a young man who had already begun to see the exploitation of Latin America by outside powers, this was confirmation delivered in the cruelest possible way. He barely escaped Guatemala himself, fleeing to the Argentine embassy for safety before making his way to Mexico. It was also in Guatemala that he met a woman named Hilda Gadia, a Peruvian economist and political exile, with connections to left-wing movements across the continent. She was older than him, more politically experienced, and she introduced him to networks of revolutionaries and radical thought that would prove essential to his path forward. Their relationship was intellectual as much as romantic, built on long conversations about Marxism, imperialism, and the future of Latin America. They would eventually marry in Mexico City in 1955, and Hilda gave birth to his first child, a daughter named Hildita, in February of 1956. Their marriage, however, existed under the growing shadow of the cause that increasingly consumed him, and it would not survive the demands of the life he was about to choose. In Mexico City, in the middle of 1955, he was introduced to a Cuban exile named Fidel Castro, who was gathering a small group of fighters intent on overthrowing the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. Their first conversation, according to those who were present, lasted through an entire night. By its end, he had agreed to join Castro's expedition, not as a soldier at first, since he had no military experience, but as the group's doctor. It was somewhere in these Mexican days that his friends and comrades began calling him Che, a term of address common in Argentina, used the way other Spanish speakers might use hey or buddy. The nickname stuck, and soon it replaced his given name almost entirely in the eyes of the world. He trained rigorously alongside the other exiles, a former Spanish Civil War veteran overseeing their guerrilla instruction in the countryside outside Mexico City. Despite his asthma, despite carrying medical supplies rather than simply weapons, he insisted on training exactly as hard as the fighters around him. And it was noted, even then, that his physical toughness and discipline surprised those who assumed the sickly intellectual would fall behind. In November of 1956, 82 men crowded onto a small and badly overloaded yacht named Granma and set sail from Mexico toward the eastern coast of Cuba. The landing was a disaster. The boat arrived days late and ran aground in a mangrove swamp far from its intended landing point. Batista's forces were waiting, alerted by an uprising that had already occurred in Santiago to draw attention away from the landing, but which instead left the rebels exposed. Within days of coming ashore, the group was ambushed and scattered, and only a small handful of survivors, fewer than 20, regrouped in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Che was wounded in the initial ambush, forced in that chaotic moment to choose between grabbing a box of ammunition or a box of medical supplies as they fled under fire. He chose the ammunition. It was, in his own later telling, the moment he stopped thinking of himself purely as a doctor and began thinking of himself as a soldier of the revolution. What followed was more than 2 years of grinding guerrilla warfare in the mountains and countryside of Cuba. Che proved himself not just brave under fire, but a genuinely skilled military strategist, rising quickly through the small rebel movements in formal ranks. He established makeshift field hospitals for wounded fighters and local peasants alike. He set up a small printing press and even a radio station to spread the movement's message, and he imposed a strict, sometimes harsh discipline on the men under his command, punishing looting and desertion severely, because he believed the revolution's legitimacy depended on the rebels behaving better than the regime they fought against. He taught fighters who could not read to write their own names. In July of 1957, he was given the rank of Comandante, one of the first in Castro's rebel army to receive it, a recognition of both his battlefield leadership and the trust Castro had placed in him. The turning point of the war came at the end of 1958, when Che was given command of a column ordered to move west across the island and cut Cuba in two. His forces captured the strategically vital city of Santa Clara after days of fierce fighting, famously derailing an armored train that Batista had sent loaded with soldiers and weapons. Using nothing more than a modified bulldozer and improvised explosives to tear up the tracks ahead of it, the fall of Santa Clara broke the back of Batista's government. Within days, on the 1st of January 1959, Batista fled the country, and the rebels marched triumphantly into Havana. In the new revolutionary government, Che was given enormous responsibility despite having no formal training in economics or finance. He served for a time as president of the National Bank of Cuba, where his signature on the new currency was reduced, almost mockingly, to the single word Che, and later as Minister of Industry. Tasked with the impossible job of steering Cuba's economy away from dependence on the United States and toward a centrally planned model inspired by the Soviet Union. He traveled abroad extensively as a kind of roving ambassador for the revolution, meeting with leaders across Africa, Asia, and the Eastern Bloc, and delivering a fiery, widely remembered speech at the United Nations in New York in December 1964, defending Cuba's right to chart its own course. He also found time to write. His account of the guerrilla campaign, along with his broader writings on revolutionary warfare and his earlier travel diaries from that motorcycle journey across the continent, would later be published and read across the world. Translated into dozens of languages, studied by movements far beyond Cuba's shores. By this point, his marriage to Hilda had ended in divorce, and his heart had settled elsewhere. During the guerrilla campaign in the mountains, he had met a young Cuban rebel fighter named Aleda March, who served as a courier and combatant for the movement, moving weapons and messages through territory controlled by government forces at great personal risk. Their relationship deepened amid the hardship of the war itself, two people who had chosen each other inside the same impossible cause they were fighting for. They married in 1959, shortly after the revolution's victory, and would go on to have 4 children together. Those who knew them described a partnership built less on romantic grand gestures and more on shared conviction, on late nights of work and ideology, on a kind of comradeship that ran as deep as affection. Whatever tenderness existed in his private life, it always seemed to share space with the larger cause that never fully released its grip on him. By 1965, that grip had pulled him away from Cuba entirely. Despite his prominent position in the government, Che had never truly wanted to become a bureaucrat or a stationary statesman. He believed, with an almost restless conviction, that revolution needed to be exported, that the model that had succeeded in Cuba could and should be repeated across the oppressed corners of the world. He resigned his official Cuban government posts and government citizenship privileges, and in a farewell letter to Fidel Castro that was only made public months later, he explained that other nations of the world were calling for his modest efforts, and that he felt bound to answer. His first destination was the Congo, then in the grip of civil war following the assassination of its independence leader Patrice Lumumba. Traveling in disguise, he led a small contingent of Cuban fighters attempting to support Congolese rebels against forces backed by Western powers and mercenaries. The campaign was a disaster almost from the start. Communication with local rebel leaders was poor. Tropical disease ravaged his men. His own asthma worsened brutally in the humid climate, and the political alliances he had hoped to build proved fragile and unreliable. After roughly 7 difficult months, the mission collapsed, and Che was forced to withdraw in near secrecy, a rare and bitter failure in a life that had, until then, moved from one success to another. Undeterred, or perhaps unable to imagine any other path for himself, he set his sights next on Bolivia, believing that a successful guerrilla campaign there could ignite revolutionary movements across the whole of South America. Striking at what he saw as the continent's most vulnerable authoritarian government. In November 1966, he arrived in Bolivia in disguise, his hair thinned and dyed, his signature beard shaved away, carrying forged documents. He established a small guerrilla base in a remote, mountainous, and sparsely populated region, gathering a mixed group of Cuban and Bolivian fighters. But almost everything worked against him from the outset. Unlike Cuba, the local peasant population in this region did not rally to his cause, viewing the foreign fighters with suspicion rather than solidarity. The Bolivian Communist Party, whose support he had counted on, largely withdrew its backing. His radio communications with Havana were unreliable, supply lines were nearly non-existent, and the terrain was punishing. Worse still, the Bolivian army, trained and advised by American Green Berets and aided by the CIA, was hunting his small band with growing precision. Through the first half of 1967, Che and his shrinking group of fighters moved through the Bolivian highlands, increasingly hungry, sick, and cut off from the outside world. Ambushed repeatedly by government forces who seemed always to know roughly where they were. His asthma attacks returned with a vengeance in the thin mountain air, and at times he could barely walk, relying on fellow fighters to help him move. His own diary entries from these final months, later recovered and published, describe a campaign steadily unraveling, marked by exhaustion, isolation, and a dwindling number of loyal men. On the 8th of October 1967, in a ravine near the village of La Higuera, Che's remaining group was surrounded and engaged by the Bolivian army. He was wounded in the fighting, his rifle rendered useless in the chaos, and he was captured alive along with a few surviving comrades. He was held overnight in a small, crumbling schoolhouse in La Higuera. According to those present, he remained composed and largely silent under questioning, offering little beyond his identity. The Bolivian government, acting under pressure and consultation with American officials, decided against a public trial, fearing the spectacle it might create and the sympathy it might generate. Instead, the order came down for his immediate execution. On the 9th of October 1967, a Bolivian sergeant entered the schoolroom where he was held and shot him. He was 39 years old. His body was displayed briefly to journalists and local officials, propped up on a concrete slab in nearby Vallegrande, his eyes strangely open, an image that would circulate across the world and be compared, by more than one observer at the time, to religious paintings of martyrdom. His hands were severed before burial, sent to Cuba as proof of death, a final grim indignity. His remains were then buried secretly beneath an airstrip in Bolivia, their location unknown to the world for nearly 3 decades, until they were finally located and exhumed in 1997 and returned to Cuba. where they were laid to rest with full honors in Santa Clara, the very city his forces had captured to help win the revolution nearly 40 years earlier. In the years since his death, the image of the young doctor-turned-guerrilla has traveled far beyond the borders of any single ideology. To many across Latin America and beyond, he remains a symbol of resistance against inequality and foreign domination, a man who walked away from comfort and privilege to fight, by his own account, for people he had never met. To others, his legacy is far more contested, tied to the harsher and more authoritarian edges of the revolutionary governments he helped build, and to the human cost of the path he believed necessary. What is beyond real dispute is the sheer improbability of the life itself. A sickly boy from Rosario who could barely breathe through his own childhood, who became a doctor, a wanderer, a guerrilla commander. And finally, one of the most photographed and endlessly reproduced faces of the 20th century, staring out from murals and T-shirts and posters in nearly every corner of the world, long after the ravine near La Higuera fell silent again. Now tell me which story I want to do next, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.